Welcome to Unlikely Intersections, the podcast where intent, impact, and inquiry inspire conversations. I'm Doc Philip Brown, my good friend Dr. Terry Jackson, and you're at the intersection. Interesting thing about intersections is that we all go through many different intersections daily. The way we navigate these determines the trajectory of our days and of our lives. Terry, welcome back. I'm glad to be here today, and I'm excited about our topic where we're going to have a recipe for mediocrity, just what everybody wants to know, how to not be very good.
That's right. I'm excited to be back as well, to be here to talk about this, because I just think there's a great deal of this that runs throughout society. And I think sometimes because people are mediocre, they mistake greatness or they mistake mediocrity for greatness oftentimes because they just don't know.
And a lot of it comes down to the metrics that we use. Mm-hmm. And, you know, when you begin to hear things like, we are a little better than the average organization of this type, or, when all the comparisons are to the mean, or, somewhere in that upper 2/3, I mean, that's mediocre too, right? Like the stuff that's under the main part of the bell curve is mediocre. Mm-hmm. There's not very good, right? And there's not a whole lot of difference between if you're way to the left on the bell curve or way to the right. If you're under those two middle sections, you can put a dime over all those data points.
That's right. It's interesting because I actually think it begins in the school system, in the elementary school system. That's where I think it actually begins. We're doing a lot of testing, and we keep talking about being average. And to me, average is synonymous with mediocre because we're talking about maybe the C plus or the C student, right? Not that there's anything bad with that, because we know there have been many C students who've become great leaders at some point in time, but there had to be a shift somewhere. But just the fact that we're talking about, we want them to be average. I'm the average this, I'm the average that. That means that you're mediocre because you don't know what it means to be great.
Even the language of we're better than average, to me, like if that's the comparison, mm-hmm. right? Then that tells you a lot about what your aspirations are. Mm-hmm. And, Jim Collins, author of Good to Great or Great by Choice, bunch of outstanding books, talks about the language of mediocrity. And basically the language is chronic inconsistency is the language of mediocrity. And you start thinking about, you can think about sports context, mm-hmm. And what do the great teams have in common? Maybe you go to the UCLA dynasties. Mm-hmm. There was no inconsistency. And there was a dedication to fundamentals, because at the beginning of every season, the first thing John Wooden taught those players, even if they were seniors versus freshmen, very first session, how to put on your socks and shoes. Mm-hmm. And you would ask those players and you would say, well, I mean, you've been doing this for 4 years and everything. Said, yeah, well, the thing is, if you're in a game and your shoe comes untied or your shoe comes off and you got to play 4-on-5 or you're down, so that just doesn't happen here. And so it's that consistency that enables greatness, because one of those hallmarks, and you see it in a lot of the great dynasty teams, whether it's UNC now, whether it's Duke, whoever, that's always there, Kansas, they rarely lose games that they're supposed to win.
That's right.
Because they don't succumb to those inconsistencies. There's a fanatical discipline.
Yep. And oftentimes, those who become great at whatever they do, their number one component, let me back up, their number one opponent is themselves. They're not playing against the other team. As they say, if we do what we are supposed to do, we will win, because we have executed as we are supposed to execute, regardless of who the opponent is. Regardless of what the obstacles are, we are great and we're going to execute. One of the things you said was very important is oftentimes people don't listen to their language.
Oh yeah, language. Leadership is all about language. In fact, there's a great book by David Marquet, who's a former nuclear submarine captain in the Navy, and the name of the book is "Leadership is Language," and it really is how you set the team up with the things you say. You set the team up for total ownership of what they're doing, of autonomous decision making with feedback loops that ensure that the right decision is made with great consistency. And there are all kinds of things that you set up that way to ensure that everything is being heard the way it needs to be heard across the whole team. Because while individual leadership is great, what you really want is a culture of leadership. You want the entire team, whether it's the C-suite, whether it's the junior executives, whether it's the directors, the managers, the coordinators, they all have to exert leadership. And so you have to build it into the culture. If you haven't done that, then you're making a recipe for mediocre.
That's right. Oftentimes, and we've heard it for years within corporate settings, organizations, even the community, empower the people. But too often, there's a lot of talk around empowering the people, yet true empowerment never really happens. We talk about decision authority, who has the ability to make what decision, and we have to be able to assign that, right? There's a story, and you've probably heard it. There was a lady who worked at the Ritz-Carlton. She was she made, for lack of a better word. She went in and cleaned the rooms. And there was a gentleman who came into the Ritz-Carlton and stayed a couple days. When she went to clean his room, she realized that he had left his laptop. She went down and found out his name, somehow found out his itinerary, the company that he worked for, and where he was going to be traveling next. Because Ritz-Carlton empowered their people to make decisions. Even though she was a maid, she had an expense account to be able to do the right thing. So what she did was she tracked that gentleman down to his next destination. She caught a plane to his next destination, delivered his laptop to him, and then went back to her hometown. And what she did that because Ritz-Carlton had a environment or a culture of leadership and a culture of accountability and more importantly, a culture of empowerment, where she was able to take a flight to deliver a laptop to a gentleman who was their client the night before so that he could be happy. That's talking about service, leadership, accountability, and empowerment. Now that's what it should look like, but too often we place limits on that, especially in today's environment, given that we are still in the pandemic and all that we have experienced around what cultures look like, because in my humble opinion, what we're seeing right now is a great deal of mediocrity everywhere we go.
Everywhere. And I would add one more thing that the Ritz did that made that possible, and that was they have enabled the people to do that.
Yes.
Because you can talk about it all you want to, but if at the end of the day there's not an account that allows her to be able to either use the account to make that purchase for that round trip ticket or get reimbursed for that round trip ticket, then it doesn't happen. Then it's just words, right?
Yeah.
And so it has to get all the way to the ground. And one of the things that I've always been impressed by organizations that truly do it right, that have level 5 leadership and have a culture of leadership, is you don't really hear them talking a lot about empowerment. It becomes embedded in the culture. It's known. It's expected. And, so much of the time we end up seeing organizations especially who have these great things on paper, but when push comes to shove, a much different set of behaviors is exercised and tolerated. And at the end of the day, you're going to get what you tolerate as well, right? And so that means if I'm the leader at whatever level, I don't tolerate it in myself, and I don't tolerate it in the people who I work with. And it doesn't mean I get rid of them, right? But it does mean I have crucial conversations that say, hey, our agreement was that we were all going to use this set of standards. Help me understand what happened in this case, because I'm not seeing, how your decision making followed that like it should. And at the end of the day, so many people, almost everybody, really wants to do a good job. They're not setting out to be mediocre, honestly. And us as leaders, we have to own that too, right? Because a lot of times, if we really listen when we have that crucial conversation, we may very well find out that, hey, I didn't communicate that very well. In fact, we might start out the conversation that way and say, our communication must not have been what it needed to be. I must not have made it clear enough that this is how we were supposed to conduct ourselves. Mm-hmm. How can I help clarify this for you?
Yep, that's right. We always say this, but very few people do it. You got to walk the talk, right? It's one thing to sit behind your desk and to deal with the challenges that come on a day-to-day basis. It's another thing to get out there and to walk down the hallway or walk out into the manufacturing facility or walk out into the offices and actually see what's going on, as a leader, so that one, it becomes the expectation from your people that they see you, that they communicate with you, and that they know when they make a decision, they're not necessarily chastised for doing so. And if they make a decision that happens to be maybe not the best decision, it's not punishment, but it's a learning opportunity of what they could have learned, what they could have done differently, right? So to me, it just comes down, it's real simple. It just comes down to people being people. I talk about the titles all the time and how we look at those titles establish certain types of relationships. And there are people who with titles, when they walk in the rooms, some people are not courageous enough to continue to express themselves a particular way, right? And so that leads to mediocrity as well, because the action and what you're saying becomes inconsistent. And that inconsistency creates that space and that gap for mediocrity.
And this is one of those. Gosh, I'm going to use myself as an example of having to really work to understand this. Having held high executive leadership positions, having been a surgeon who is the captain of the ship in many contexts. Mm-hmm. As well. One of the things that I failed to realize for a long time, I'm better at it now and I'm still working on it, is that people put a lot more credence on everything I say than maybe what it's worth, mm-hmm. right? Mm-hmm. And so I have to be really careful in a couple of areas. Number one, I have to be careful that what I say doesn't get interpreted as an edict. Mm-hmm. And so mm-hmm. I ended up, when you take control of everything that's in your life and how things are rolling out, it makes you examine things like, how in the world did this happen in this context, right? And it's not that somebody else did it. It is, how in the world did I allow this to happen, mm-hmm. On my chessboard of life, basically. Mm-hmm. And, so I realized that with those positions comes a certain amount of deference that is not necessarily warranted nor desirable. And so you have to do things to intentionally flatten any hierarchy so that you can get the information moving faster. I realize that, people might not want to tell me if things weren't exactly the way they wanted to because they're trying to please me as a leader, right? And to me, I don't want to be pleased as a leader. I want us to be successful and deliver results, which means we all need to know when things aren't exactly on track. Again, that's a leadership is language thing. There are ways that you set that up, and perhaps we can do an episode on that in the future. But those kind of things are real hazards for leaders. If you reach certain positions, you're definitely no longer part of the club. You have to be aware of that. You're going to get filtered information. You have to be aware of that. And you have to put countermeasures in place to make sure that that doesn't happen. But one of those countermeasures is that culture of leadership, because that's a powerful attenuator of that phenomenon, right? Because if everyone is living into this culture of leadership, then they're leading up as well as leading down. And that is a whole skill set in and of itself. One other thing you said, and this is going to change the topic from what I just was back to where you were earlier. This whole business of being able to get down on the shop floor, management by walking around, if you will. One of the things, that's the mediocre version of that is leadership by spreadsheet.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's required to successfully be able to get down there amongst the front line and look is you have to deeply understand the context. And so no matter what corporate environment you're in, whether it's, computers, whether it's healthcare, whether it's education, there's got to be a certain amount of background in the core functions. And if that is absent, then you have a very difficult time understanding the context well enough to identify what's going on. So that becomes a whole nother cut of filtered information. And one of the things I've seen is that, there is a tendency for leaders to totally disregard that and think that just because they've been in one part of an industry that they understand the whole thing, and that's just not accurate.
Right, not the case at all. I always recommend leaders go humbly into new positions. It's really about the question and understanding what's going on in the new industry or the new department of an organization. It's not about going and telling people what to do. I think too often what happens is leadership is people begin to think selfishly. And so they begin to think that I got to make my mark on this department, this new job that I'm in. Sure, you do have to make your mark, but the mark comes in your results. In order to get great results, you got to first understand. So that means that there's a learning process that you have to go into. There's the question to those who already know in that department what's actually going on. So it's not about being the leader and knowing everything and telling everything. I think you said it before, and we've heard some other people say this. Years ago, it used to be the leadership was telling people what to do. Today, leadership is about knowing the right question to ask to understand.
Yeah, it's a coordinative function now more than anything,
Yes.
because it has to do with the rate of knowledge increase, right? And so healthcare, I've said a number of times, I think the volume of healthcare knowledge doubles every 70 to 75 days. So there's no such thing as a single expert, right? It is how do you coordinate teams to have the right cultural leadership to create communication paradigms that are effective enough to adapt to the onslaught of information that we have. And it has to evolve to be egoless.
Mm-hmm.
It has to be about the greater good. It has to be about the results. If you really want to be anything other than mediocre.
Yeah, I agree.
And, we can, I'll use healthcare because that's where I'm most familiar. But if you look at healthcare in our country, we're incredibly mediocre. And I say that because of the inconsistency.
Mm-hmm.
We can have great results for given problems. In fact, we can have great results for almost any medical problem, but we don't on a consistent basis. We have too many people who are bankrupted by the process of getting their basic health care needs taken care of. We have people who are harmed because something fell through the cracks. And that inconsistency, going back to our earlier definition, that defines mediocrity. Doesn't have to stay that way. But we've got to have leadership that's humble enough to understand what it takes, that it takes this relentless pursuit of cultural change, of a culture of leadership, so that people can act in the best interest of another who is at a very stressed time in their life on a really consistent basis. And when we're able to do that, which I really believe we can, if we can summon the collective will to do it, then I think we can see our health outcomes dramatically improve. It's going to have to be defined a little more broadly than what we've defined it and some other things, but it's absolutely within the realm of possibility. And certainly for certain organizations to do that in certain pockets is really close right now. We can do it.
Most leaders think that when they get to a new position, that they have to be 100% ready. I'm not a proponent of that. I'm thinking 75 to 80% ready. And that other 25 to 20%, it enables growth. It enables the evolution of understanding what you're getting into. Certain skill sets have to be in place, the people skills, being able to bring people together in a collective for the greater good of the organization, for the greater good of the department. But there still is a 20 to 25% where you got to understand that that's where the growth is going to happen, so that I can grow into this position of being the type of leader needed for this department, or being the type of leader that's needed for this organization. So learning is a part of that equation. So it's not about being ready. It's about, I know that I'm ready, but I know that I still have all of this to learn about being a better leader, being more skilled, more knowledgeable about this industry or this particular department, so that I can help my people make the best decisions as we continue to perform our task.
Absolutely. It's the student of leadership concept, right? Yep. And, when we had Gary Ridge here the other day, he talked about himself as a student of leadership, as a learner. And I think the best leaders truly are. That's what maintains the humility. And, that's another thing that is crucial in high-level leadership, is this productive paranoia. And it's a fear of, it's not an unhealthy fear. It is a fear of, what am I missing? What's going to sneak up and get us if we're not ready for it? What tabletop scenario can I plan out that's going to save people's lives when they come into my organization in this way? Or, what kind of scenario planning can I do that helps make everything safer in this dangerous endeavor we're doing? Maybe that's nuclear energy. Maybe it's construction. It's anything, but it's this disciplined understanding and really a productive paranoia, which is another Jim Collins term, that says I'm constantly thinking and challenging my culture to imagine what is going to derail our train, what is going to keep us from delivering the way we have committed together to deliver. And when you do that, it gives you a chance to practice.
Man, that goes back to that what if question. It enables you to create all these different scenarios. They may not happen, but if they do, you're already aware, and it goes back to the word awareness again, right? So one of the greatest, skills a leader can have is the awareness, which kind of, the awareness leads to anticipation, right? And so you're anticipating, you're aware, you're humble. That's not a part of a scenario or an equation or a recipe of being mediocre, right? That's a part of being great. But too many mistake what they do for being great when it's not. All we have to do is look at companies today, whether they're local, whether they're global, and see what's happening. And there's much more mediocrity than there is greatness.
And a lot of times you get a phenomenon that good is the enemy of great.
Mm-hmm.
Because when it's good enough, which is, in great competitors' minds, there's no such thing. But in a lot of people's minds, good translates to fat and happy.
Mm-hmm.
It's good enough, right? Like my needs are being met. I have a reasonable salary, we're better than average. Life is good. Some of my neighbors, they use my business and they tell me what a great experience it is, and it gets real easy to ignore the places where folks maybe are not having a good experience, right? And you might even fall into the trap of making that somebody else's problem, right? Maybe, if these people on my team were doing better, this wouldn't happen. We're really okay, but, and that's not it, because the leader, and I'm using leader in the plural sense, this has to be a cultural leadership. Mm-hmm. Everybody has to own everything that's on the plate. And it may be actually that in this particular case, it wasn't their direct responsibility that was the break point. Mm-hmm. But they got to do a rigorous analysis of, is there something I could have done different that would have prevented this break point? Is there something that needs to be fundamentally restructured that is systematic? And so it's this constant process of always interrogating what happened.
I'm listening to you, and I'm thinking about the lack of interrogation and how that breeds mediocrity, which means there's a lack of curiosity, right? Lack of imagination, which we lump all these people together. And then I begin to think about what I see in Little League sports. And some people are not going to agree with me, and that's okay. But we get, at least at the time when I played, there was no participation trophies. There were trophies for those who went out and excelled. And in excelling, they became champions. And so just because you participated, you were participating to win. And winning is not a bad thing, because to win, that means there has to be chemistry on that team, where there's a team working together in such a way that they find ways to overcome all the obstacles put in front of them by their opponents. That's a great thing. But in the society where you got participation trophies, but just participating, I'm good because I participated, that breeds mediocrity. You can look at what's happening in some professional sports. Guys are getting high salaries, but not one of them are talking about a championship, because that's a hard thing to do, to get the right players, the right team, the right chemistry working together, everyone knowing their roles and responsibilities in order to win a championship. The mediocrity is in, I made a lot of money. Everybody's making a lot of money in the league. That's relative. Were you able to be on a team, to understand and realize what your role was and how to win a championship. Not just to participate, because that championship signifies a very rare fraternity of those who were able to win a ring given the time that they spent in whatever professional league it was, right? And so we have to, in my opinion, get away from awarding people for strictly participating.
Yeah, and I'm always one to say, let's look at organizationally, let's look at how we define win.
Mm-hmm.
And, I've had a number of experiences where when you peel that onion back inside an organization, people's real definition of winning ends up going directly back to their individual performance.
Mm.
And that is not usually a real indicator of a win in my book, right? Because it has to be about the greater good of whatever the organization is trying to do. In sports, it's a championship. In healthcare, it's taking care of people, all the people that come across. It's how can you be on this quest for really perfect care is that's the only holy grail in healthcare, in my opinion, is perfect care. And that's variable depending on the person. It requires different things, different knowledge. Kind of like my book, it's there, do you speak patient? Each patient actually has a different definition of perfect, and you have to peel that back. But you can deliver it. It's all going to be within a set of boundaries. You only run into a problem when you get outside that set of boundaries for a given patient. And anyway, industry by industry, winning has to be consistent with what the organization's going to do, not with the individual's metrics. That gets us back to a concept of how we look at data. And, data, in order to make sense of it in a statistical sense, you've got to normalize it. You've got to put in a number of different assumptions. And when you look at highly complex industries, the silos lead you astray. Because while it may look great with this set of assumptions, when you put it into play, that set of assumptions can be 180 degrees opposite from what you're seeing. And so while that empiric information is important, by itself, it's inadequate. And that gets us to kind of the third thing, of great organizations is they use empiric creativity. That's two words that you may not often hear together, right? It's empiric, which means it's based on empirical evidence, data, but it's creative, which means it's adapted to the situation. And that gets us into the realms of human judgment, which requires context of the situation. And so when you get, one of the things I think we see a lot of times now is that we have highly talented people on these leadership teams, but they're not exactly sitting in the right seat on the bus. And so you end up with a situation where the whole is less than the sum of the parts, which is fundamentally the opposite of what we're trying to achieve, right? A great team is where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. And until we get folks in the right seat on the bus, if you will, in the right location in the organization, with the right culture of leadership, with the right level of drive toward what the organization is trying to accomplish, with the right level of humility that says, I can't do this by myself, I need help. This is a collective problem-solving exercise to go into the next phase of work. And one of the cool things about empiric creativity, and this is another Jim Collins thing, is fire bullets, then cannonballs. And the idea is that, when you have analyzed your data and you think you have a creative empiric solution that'll work, you got to test it. And you test it, with a small pilot. And if it works, you may scale it a little bit, and if it works again, you may scale it again. But you're doing a lot of little small surgical tests, right? Marksmanship tests before you launch the big missile at it. And so you have cut down the margin for error because you've tested it a lot. And some things you test and they're a disaster, and you say, "Whoop, not going to do that again." But you haven't hurt the organization because it was a small test. And these are things that that underscore how important it is to put everything together. Without the right context, you can't do it. You got to have context as a part of that decision making.
And what we see today are too many organizations who don't do that. They figure, hey, 1 or 2, let's throw it out there and let's see what happens. We're going to cannonball after 1 or 2 shots, and that's just what we see around mediocrity with organizations, right? The language that they're speaking is different. They're speaking the great language, but the actions are mediocrity, right? It's amazing. I was in a meeting the other night, and it became a little pretentious, right? As I sat there listening to 2 gentlemen have a conversation, both of whom were supposed to be leaders. And I said supposed to be leaders. And when you have to be able to have crucial, tough conversations. But those crucial, tough conversations also have to be respectful conversations, right? Because we're always dealing with another human being. And so one gentleman made a perfect point. He said, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. And I said to myself, he's absolutely right. Because you could have said the same thing in a different way and got a better reaction. You could have said it in a way where you were seeking understanding versus seeking, because of your role, you felt as though the role and the authority that you had in the role usurped how you said it, which as a leader, he lost all respect as a result of that. And you have to be mindful of that. That's why language is such important, because our most important asset are the people, and the people are going to get the work done. And if the people don't get the work done, then it makes the leader not look good. I think I always say this: all roads lead from and to leadership. So leadership has to be the example of what it means to be humble, what it means to be an effective communicator, what it means to be great, to dispel all the mediocrity that we see throughout society. Even in the pandemic, if we look at some of our national leaders, there were questions around, how do we handle this? Some were seeking more understanding, but some was trying to say, hey, without any understanding, here's what we need to do. I mean, you have to find a good balance in it, but I think there was a lot of mediocrity at higher levels, and at more local levels, there was a lot of great leadership.
Yeah, I think we did see that. It made it difficult at times to function. But what I hear you saying is, when it becomes more about making a point than getting what we wanted to get as a result as an organization consistent with our values, then that's mediocre or worse, right? Because those crucial conversations have to be about getting to the answer that's going to work best within the construct of what your organization is trying to do, or your unit, or your small team, whatever it is. It doesn't matter. The context is the same. And so that's where the humility piece comes in, right? That's also, like I was talking earlier, there's a peril that exists for a leader who may unintentionally slant the table by saying what he or she thinks ought to happen. that can shut down the dialogue, when in fact what you need to have, you've got to have robust dialogue where all the voices are heard in a way that enables the non-empirical information to come out, right, in a way that you can then create judgments, load your gun with bullets, and do these experiments to see if you're on the right track. And too often it gets to be a contest of wills of who gets to have their way. And as a leader, the moment that you find that your team is making it more about what they think you want than what the stated goals are, then you know you're in deep trouble. And so often, that is the siren call of leadership, right? It is so easy to fall into that trap because you don't recognize it right off the bat a lot of times. That's, again, where that culture of leadership has to come in, because you have to surround yourself with people who you know are going to tell you what you need to hear, not what they think you want to hear.
That's right. And that goes back to, I think, to a book that we talked about a couple of weeks ago, and that is the who, not the how, right?
Right.
The right people around you who, again, going to tell you what you need to hear, not what you want to hear, but who are authentically themselves and understand that it's about the greater good. And you've heard me say this before and ask this question many times. Oftentimes when we're in leadership, and in order to prevent or minimize the mediocrity, we have to be willing to ask ourselves, what are we willing to sacrifice to be great? What are we willing to sacrifice for the greater good of the organization?
Yeah. And so many of the time that answer is my opinion.
Right.
Right? If you can just start there,
yeah, that's right.
It opens a whole door for you to hear things differently. And, one of the things about leadership is that it's not a pronouncement. You come into a large organization and there is already a culture. It might not be maybe what you believe will be the most productive. It may not be even what you might think will work. But what you have to do is understand what's in the ground, and then you have to use the language of what's possible to begin to enroll people in something that is better. Because it doesn't matter as much what you say as what the actions end up being, right? And so people get trapped. They get trapped into thinking that, this set of conditions I keep seeing is keeping me from performing like I want to. It's holding me back. It occurs to me that there's no chance that we can really be real successful with this approach, but we're doing okay, and this is kind of what I have to work with, and here we go, and mediocre we are forever as long as we're like that. So the language of leadership has to inspire possibility that, hey, there's some other places we could get with this same set of conditions. Now, we probably got to work together to figure out where they are, and I heard you say that, this is what you're seeing, and well, what about what some other folks are seeing, and I see this, and you work together to breathe possibility into life.
Yep.
And it really starts with reframing the conditions as people are seeing them, because we get blind to our daily stimuli. You drive the same way to work every day. You get there, you can't remember hardly anything you saw unless something just crazy popped out, and so we have to again create that culture where something better is believable. Right. We have to be able to believe that, hey, something different could happen. We just have to figure it out, and if we can figure it out together, it'll be better.
And here's a question that you possibly ask yourself. What can I do to create the conditions for this to change? Or what can I do to create the conditions for greatness to be the norm in my department, in this organization, in my community, in this society? Because it's always about creating the conditions.
It is, and it comes back to owning all the conditions to which you feel you're subject.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's being the board, right?
Mm-hmm.
It is Jocko Willink is extreme ownership,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like
Mm-hmm.
this is all, everything that I'm looking at is within my purview to impact.
Mm-hmm.
Lots of things are out of control, but I can have an impact,
Mm-hmm.
and my team together can have a tremendous impact. But we got to take it right where it is. We got to be responsible for everything we're seeing. We got to do the scenario planning. We got to fanatically discipline ourselves to understand what it takes to do this 20-mile march every day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, and oh wow, this came up. This is a little different than what we expected. But we know from our empiric evidence, from our experience, from our scenario planning, that a viable step might be this. Boom, we try it. Right? We overcome. We innovate.
It's a relentless pursuit.
Relentless.
It's a relentless pursuit, right? For greatness, a relentless pursuit for excellence, right? That was Tom Peters wrote, In Search of Excellence, right? It's you never get there. It's not a destination, right? There's always something to be improved upon. There's always a new approach, but it's relentless, right? And that's what drives great organizations. Not that, there are great organizations that exist, but there are many more that could be great if they had that relentless pursuit and they asked themselves the questions about, what do we do for the greater good? What am I willing to sacrifice? How do I create the conditions? What if? It's all in the question, and it's all in the imagination.
Yep, absolutely. Well, man, this has been a great conversation. I hope we've helped people understand mediocrity, understand some of the factors behind it, understand some of the ways that you can transcend that performance and move toward greatness. If you'd like to hear more of our episodes, you can pick us up at unlikelyintersection.com. You can find us at Unlikely Intersections on Facebook, on YouTube. You can find me at docphilipbrown.com. And Terry?
You can find me on LinkedIn, Terry Jackson, PhD. You can find me on Facebook. Please go to our website, go to our YouTube page, like, comment, and share. And if you have any topics you'd like to hear us discuss, please feel free to leave it in the comments.
We'll see you at the next intersection.